Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our fourth AutoTalk program. I am Dan Barson, your host for today's session. I'm really pleased to introduce Laramie Sandquist. He's the General Manager, Risk Management Resources for Federated Insurance. Laramie, take her away.
All right, thank you, Dan. And Dan, I appreciate the invitation to be a part of these webinar series that you guys have to talk about the different risks that are out there and just things to help dealers out. And our association with AIADA has been there a while through Federated, and so we definitely appreciate being part of these. So we're hitting on a topic today that we get a lot of questions about, and it's a moving target that's out there, and we call it cybercrime and trying to take the bullseye off your business. And ultimately what we're going to try to talk about is what is the problem that's going on out there in the business world? How does this all happen? What's your business impact and some of the costs? And then trying to get to the bottom of how you can protect yourself. But as I said early on, it's kind of a moving target, and I think we see different headlines on a weekly basis, if not daily basis, of these different attacks that are going on out there, whether they be for big business or small business or just individual people in general. So we'll talk through some of that today and try to get to the bottom of what's going on out there from a cyber standpoint. So start off by just talking about some of the uses of the internet. And when surveyed, about 87% of people said they have one or more employees who use the internet daily for operations. For me, I think that's kind of a low number because I don't know if I could work without using the internet. And 73% say having a safe and trusted internet is critical to their success. 55% say that a loss of internet for 48 straight hours would be disruptive to their business, and 38% say that would be extremely disruptive to their business. So I think we're seeing more and more businesses out there very reliant on the internet for both internal purposes as well as external purposes on getting to their customers and their services out to folks. So we try to get to what is a data breach, and the definition of it varies across all lines, but it basically gets down to the unauthorized acquisition of personally identifiable information. So that could be anything up to and including their first and last name, social security numbers, date of birth, driver's license number, financial account information, or anything that wouldn't be easy to access just through normal channels. So with auto dealers in particular, I think we are collecting a lot of information about customers throughout the various processes that we have, whether it's just the sales process of getting a name, address, maybe even cell phone numbers and email addresses to be able to contact customers, to everyone including the finance folks who are getting more in-depth information about folks, which may include these social security numbers, date of births, and financial information about these individual customers. So there is a lot of sensitive data that folks are taking in, and how are you protecting that data? Because there have been a lot of national headlines out there, and we can name many of them, but you've got the Targets of the world we've heard of, you got the Home Depots, the Jimmy Johns, the IRS even got hit, the U.S. Postal Service, eBay, but you had some smaller organizations get hit as well now. And so there's more and more of this going on out there than people are even realizing. And so we ask, what's the disconnect with small business? Well, majority of them say that they're safe from cyber threats. They don't think these hackers are going to get them. They say it's only going after the big business because those are the only ones making the headlines. So that's where our 77% comes from. They say they've got pretty much things in place, and their IT folks will be able to take care of this. So they say 66% said they're not really concerned from an outside threat, whether that be a hacker, cyber criminal, or even an ex-employee or a contractor that they work with. 47% think that won't have a lot of impact on their business. And it's kind of interesting because that's a disconnect from the previous slide I showed where a lot of them said it would have a pretty big impact on their business. And then 18% say they wouldn't even know if their network was compromised or the information was breached. So there is kind of a disconnect of these small businesses thinking that it's not really their issue. And it gets to this next slide where back in 2011, about 18% of folks were getting hit by cyber attacks from a small business standpoint. And you can see that we look at that as 500 employees or less. And up to 2014, the numbers came out, and it was about 36%. So you can see over a 3-year time frame that those numbers have doubled. And if we were to run numbers probably as of today in 2015, we may be closer to that 40 or 50% range. And the scary part about this is that what most people are finding is that 60% of these businesses that have these breaches will close within 6 months, because there's a lot of different issues that come into play. Not only the expense issue, but the bigger piece is that reputation and the loss of customers. And I think everyone realized that with the Target breach, that there are still many people that are afraid of shopping at Target and maybe won't even use a credit card or anything like that to make a purchase at Target because they're so afraid of it, even though Target probably has the most secure networks now that are out there. So there is this whole psychological piece of these data breaches when it comes to from a customer standpoint. So it's something to be aware of. And so the question comes out is, how is this data compromised? There are a lot of different ways things get done out there, and we like to look at things just outside of just the regular hacker, because folks sometimes aren't afraid of the hacker, as we saw in the previous slide. So there are a lot of different things that go on out there. There's this physical theft that they call it. That's someone actually stealing a laptop. Actually had a cyber professional come in and speak to a group of mine not too long ago, and he said, you know what, I was in a taxi cab down in Orlando, Florida, and I left my laptop bag in the back of the taxi. He's like, I got distracted and I was in a hurry and left the laptop bag there, and sure as heck, the laptop was gone. And he said, luckily, they were able to remote wipe all the information off that laptop. But he said, that's a prime example. I mean, just people. People make mistakes, and they can be the most cyber literate people out there. They can work for a cybersecurity firm, and they can still lose their laptop. So that's one way, just having these laptops lost. There's the dumpster divers that are out there. So we've heard of those in the past, and they're still out there and relevant. Folks that aren't shredding important documents that have sensitive information on it and aren't using an outside company to pick up that shredded material, we still do see some cyber theft based off of the dumpster divers, so keep that in mind. The bigger one is this employee theft and the file cabinet security. Employees have access to a lot of different information, and so one of the solutions we'll talk through here in a little bit is how do we limit the employees' access so they're only getting access to the information that they readily need, not opening them up to the entire network, putting those controls in place so that depending on their job and their position that they have in the company, they can see what they need to see. And the same thing with file cabinet security. Do we keep all those internal personal records personal files secure, and do we keep all of our customer files secure as well? I know a lot of that is going online nowadays, but there still are folks out there that have physical paper copies of a lot of information, and are we making sure that that information is secured as well? And then the ones on the right are more what we think of probably of how data would be compromised. It's the mobile devices. It's our folks bringing their own device to work. I think that's a topic that's used out there, BYOD, whether they're using an iPad-like device, some kind of mobile device from that standpoint, or just using a cell phone, smartphone, to access the computer network and to be able to communicate that way. How are those devices controlled, number one, but then how is the access on those limited to what they specifically need for that point in time? Other things that come into mind are cloud and online storage, making sure that you're working with reputable vendors from an online storage standpoint, making sure that those clouds are secured and there's backups in place, security things in place to protect your online storage. And then ultimately it's the hackers. And I think basically what it's come to in the world today is that if a hacker wants to get in, they'll probably be able to find a way in, but you don't want to leave the door open for them. So many, many very good hackers can get through locked doors pretty easily, but they can get through an unlocked door a lot easier than they can a locked door. So some of the things they're talking about now is just making sure that you're doing all you can do to not keep yourself as that low-hanging fruit, so to say, so the hackers aren't able to just go after you without having a big impact on their end. So that's kind of an overview of where it starts, but then it gets into what's it cost? What is a business looking for from this standpoint, and what impacts it can have? And number one, the first thing that everyone needs to think about is this whole response and notification. So most states nowadays have notification laws in place where they specifically say this is how you have to respond if and when you identify a breach within your business. So you can see the states there listed. And the interesting thing about this, or difficult thing about this for us from a risk management standpoint, is each state's a little different in their notification laws. And so if you're doing operations in multiple states, you may have to, figure out what each individual state requires in the event of a data breach. So that's the first and foremost, is doing this response and notification. The next one is this whole credit monitoring piece. A lot of states are requiring that you provide some kind of credit monitoring. Pretty consistent one you're seeing out there is a 1-year monitoring service that folks who have been impacted can go out and use free of charge. I think now we're seeing a lot of places do a 2-year credit monitoring because the hackers are getting pretty smart with the data and they're not using it in the first year, and so they offer a 2nd year of free monitoring. But that's another expense that's out there that folks need to look at. And when it's all said and done, what they say between this whole credit monitoring and the data breach notification stuff is that it costs a little over $200 per record, and that's per record that's compromised. So if you've got, let's say, 1,000 employee files or customer files, whatever it happens to be, that are compromised, it's pretty easy math to figure out what that potential expense could be. And that's not even including any expense related to someone actually compromising that data and using it. There may be additional expense on top of that. That's just the notification laws and the credit monitoring piece that gets you to that $200. So some after the fact things you need to look at is the whole identity repair piece. Depending on who that customer is, their impact, their influence over the dealership, the community, whomever. It may be a lot of work because they have to work with bank and credit institutions, and they got to try to get their identity repaired. And I just kind of love this picture here because I could just picture that happening if my data were ever compromised. That'd be me sitting at the kitchen table saying, where do I start? And that's, to be honest with you, where a lot of people are when it comes to this. There's a lot of worry, there's a lot of headaches, and a lot of unknowns. And so this whole identity repair process not only is costly from an expense standpoint of having to work with these institutions, but it's costly just from a psychological standpoint, and customers feeling that, just feel violated. You could have some third-party liability. So depending on how big this breach is, there could be larger damages, including class action lawsuits. I think we're seeing that with Target now and some of the bigger ones. So could a dealer be brought into something like that? It depends, but it's something to be aware of, because all of that gets back to how you respond to this whole crisis and how you well, number one, do you know if a data breach actually happened? But then have you taken the steps ahead of time to know how to handle this if the inevitable potentially happens to you? And so that could involve, working specifically with a public relations firm and having some kind of disaster emergency action plan dealing specifically with a data compromise breach that you could potentially have. So, we talk a lot about having disaster plans in place in the event of a hurricane or a tornado or a flood or a fire or things like that. But a lot of folks don't think in terms of, well, what happens? What kind of a public relations nightmare could it be if we had a data compromise or something like that? So, something to think about from that standpoint as you're doing disaster planning. And then some other smaller things, and I shouldn't even call them smaller, but things that have popped up more recently is just these whole ransom situations. And I don't know if anyone has heard of these before, but we're seeing these pop up where folks will log into their network, and some hacker has gotten in there and put some kind of code on their computer, whether it be malware, or some kind of virus, that basically says you can't have access to your network until you pay us a certain amount of money. That may be $500, that may be $5,000, that may be, whatever amount they choose that day. And they will not, allow you to access that network without getting in, or without paying the money. And so we're seeing these pop up from time to time, and depending on how sophisticated it is, you may or may not be able to get in without paying the fee. we've actually seen some where people have tried to get in, they've tried to use their IT folks to get in, and IT comes back and says, you know, we just can't do it. And the ransom at first had started at like $500, and then since they tried over a couple days to try to back end it on their own side, the third day when they couldn't get in, they finally go back and say, okay, I'll pay you the $500, and they have raised the ransom then to $1,500 or $2,500 because they didn't pay it up right away. So a lot of just random ransom type things that are going on out there that you just need to be aware of. There are also things coming, you know, from a business interruption and extra expense standpoint of, you know, what do you do if your website's down? So if, you know, something happens out there and someone hacks your network and gets a hold of it, and you have to take the website down for, you know, an hour or 5 hours or 5 days, like what does that cost you? And, you know, what kind of backup plan do you have for something like that? Because we are seeing those, the maintenance piece from a network standpoint. Because in the end, there have been some businesses that have had to shut down, at least temporarily, if not fully, because of some of these incidents that have happened out there. So those are things you need to definitely be thinking about. Another area of concern for folks is this area we call impaired access. That means someone getting into your network, but then your network being connected to supplier networks or other networks. So once they breach your network, they may be able to get into someone else's network, and then they may be able to get into someone else's network and someone else's network, and you can just see where it would spiral from there, and they would have access to a lot of different pieces of information out there. So, and that gets into some of this class action stuff, that if they can find out that your network was the one that was initially breached, and now you've allowed them to get into other people's networks, it's something to be thinking about. And it's also something to be thinking about is if you're tied into other people's networks, if you're allowing other outside vendors or manufacturers or things like that to have access to your systems, how are you limiting their access so that if someone breaches their network, that you've got some protocols in place that they won't be able to get into your network. So things to think about from that standpoint. Another piece is computer forensics. This is kind of the after the fact, once you've been breached, trying to figure out how and why it happened. And sometimes that can be an easy process, and sometimes that can be a long, drawn-out process. And I think that's the hardest thing for a lot of people to recognize when a breach happens is they kind of sit back and say, well, couldn't you find out right away why this happened? I think the Target breach, the one that was out there that most know about, I don't think they knew for about 3 weeks. They were monitoring it, they were trying to figure out what was going on, but then finally they got to the bottom of it. And a lot of these take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to figure out how and why these breaches happen. And so another piece that's out there is just computer fraud and funds transfer. I think this is one that scares most people. They think people are going to get access to your bank accounts and things like that. And that does happen, but generally banks have pretty good security on their end. They are held to regular audits on their end, and so they are getting checked pretty frequently. But there is the potential risk of that happening, of having that whole computer fraud and funds transfer. And on the back end, if it's found that your business hasn't taken good steps and protocols to keep these unwarranted people out, there could be regulatory fines and penalties that come from governmental agencies as well. And so there are compliance measures out there. I think most people are aware of the PCI requirements and things like that. I think you actually just had a webinar on that not too long ago. But that would be an example of where the government may step in and say, yeah, you guys weren't in compliance with protecting this data. So the back end is, what can you do about it? And tried to boil this down to, some very simple and practical steps. But number one, we looked at, basically just protect your information and protect your customers' information. And how do you do that? Well, number one, you want to kind of look at your overall password management. I mean, first and foremost, that's probably a simple one, is how are passwords managed? How are people able to access it right now from an employee standpoint? And then making sure that those passwords are tough and that people are following good, strong password guidelines. But then it's limiting those rights for the local administrators as well to say, okay, what customers, what employees get what access to our system, and limiting that access to keep to keep your systems almost compartmentalized so people can't get into other areas. Protecting your company's online reputation, and this gets into obviously managing what things are out there, what trends are out there, what people are saying about your business, and how they've been able to interact with you from an online standpoint. Because let's be honest, there are a lot of people out there that don't do the face-to-face anymore. They specifically want to talk to you or know about you through some kind of network, and whether that be a social network or some kind of online posting board or something like that. So managing that reputation online is key. Keeping a clean machine, I think that goes without saying, but some folks have actually gotten to the point where they're not allowing folks to go to certain websites, keeping people off of those things, using obviously the virus scans and the malware protection and things like that. One of the big things a lot of people are running into is just these phishing attacks that are out there where someone will send an email telling you to click on a link, and then all of a sudden, once you click on the link, it installs some kind of malware, some kind of bot, or whatever it happens to be on the computer through this phishing scam. And so, just educating your employees as to what to do with emails that may be in question, that are seemingly normal, but you kind of question it in the back of your mind. A lot of security experts are saying just delete them, and then follow up with the person you think it was coming from to say, okay, was this really you? And if it was, can you resend me that email? Because there are a lot of people that are just, I don't know, just kind of naive to it, to think, okay, well, this is coming from AIADA, it must be a good email. And so just getting people to think through that standpoint is key. And so on this back end, there are some insurance options that are out there. Federated has some options on data compromise. We do have risk management services out there from an e-risk hub standpoint that kind of works people through that. But there are a lot of different options now from an insurance standpoint. But what folks need to really do is, before they even start thinking about insurance, is start thinking about what is the current state of our network. Because to be honest with you, the underwriters who underwrite this type of insurance are very, very sophisticated, and they will ask a lot of tough questions about your current network status, your network security, your network access, all of these things that you're going to have to know prior to even filling out an insurance application. And the answers to those questions are obviously going to determine how comfortable that insurance carrier is in taking on that risk. So that risk management services, the prevention stuff on the front end is very important to know when applying for insurance coverage. So I'll just sum it up here by saying, for a lot of people, the single biggest risk involving this cybersecurity is just misunderstanding and thinking that we're not going to be impacted by this. Kind of going back to the first couple slides of saying, we've got an IT person and everything's okay. And what we're seeing is that, yes, it's very good to have the IT professional on staff, but it's also very, very important to educate employees and educate them on a regular basis. It can't just be a one and done. It has to be a continual follow-up with them that, hey, you get this email in, we need to protect it. You only have this type of access. This is what we do with customer data. And just making sure that they understand the whys behind doing this, that it's not just an added step in the process that is going to cause them a loss of sale or something like that, but it's pertinent and critical to your business success on the back end that they follow these procedures. And so with that, it looks like there are a couple questions out there that I can take on. And so the first one is, within a dealership environment specifically, what areas do you consider the greatest risk to a hacker seeking customer data? That could be anything. Really what they're looking for is personally identifiable information. So anywhere that you're keeping that customer information or even employee information, I think what we're seeing with the government is they lost a lot of employee data. And so they're looking at any way to access information. So seeing where each area of that information is being housed. So maybe your customer data is in one part of your network and employee data is another piece of that. But making sure that your security, your firewalls, things like that are consistent across the board. So if they get into your network, they hopefully can't get to those pieces of data, so they're more highly secured or things like that. I think that's important. because those are the pieces of information they're looking for, is that personally identifiable information. Second one is we use a data manager which has its own protections. What is our liability if our data is breached through one of their approved vendors? That's a good question. A lot of that will be based off your contracts and things like that. The biggest risk that you have from that standpoint is probably reputational, even if you can transfer the monetary risk. But even if it was someone else's fault, it doesn't make you any less reputationally liable for that. So yeah, that would be something that you want to look at with your data manager to kind of figure out who's responsible for what pieces. What antivirus software, hardware, firewalls, web filters, routers, network management tools, patch tools, et cetera, do you recommend? This is a tough question, and I am not a software guy. I'll be the first one to tell you that. I'm an insurance guy. But even talking with the gurus on this, there's not a hard and fast, this is the best one to use. So basically what they say is be consistent with it. So if you're working with one specific security firm, that has an antivirus software, firewalls, and things like that, just make sure that they're covering everything, because if you're using different vendors, they may not play well together. So look at that specifically, and ultimately, obviously work with either your internal IT staff or your external IT staff to make sure that these areas are protected. Yeah, the last one is don't forget to mention limiting public Wi-Fi access. Some dealerships just put the wireless access point and turn on guest network, no encryption, no pass. Yeah, that's a good one too, is if you are offering, which I think a lot of folks are, is allowing Wi-Fi in your dealerships, in the service areas, wherever you may be doing that, make sure that that's protected, encrypted, has some password things in it. I know it's a little bit more complicated and cumbersome for the client to do that, but making sure that that's shored up as well, because you don't want them being able to access your individual network through some kind of guest portal that's out there. So making sure you're checking into those. So, Dan, a couple more questions that came up this morning that I may throw out here is we don't have an in-house IT person. However, I think it's a good idea to have a professional check our systems and practices. Are there any vendors out there? Yeah, there are quite a few vendors out there. We've actually worked with a place out of Iowa called ACES Iowa. That's ACESIOWA.com. But there are a lot of different folks out there that will do outside audits. They can actually do them remotely, and they can take care of things like that. Someone had asked about the data breaches at auction houses for used cars. I have heard this actually at our Risk Management Academy in May. A lot of people brought that to my attention, that this has happened and it's going on. So there is some of this is going on, but this gets into limiting that access to those outside vendors and making sure that you've got those access points controlled, and really scrutinizing their need and use of different areas of your network itself. All good questions there that we've gotten from different folks through the session throughout today. So,
well, Laramie, thank you so very, very much for your time today, this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Everybody, Laramie was on this morning on our 10 a.m. session. So, again, I want to thank you very much. You will receive a copy of the slide deck and the video or the audio as well. That should come within the next several days. So again, anybody that registered for the program will receive this. Mark your calendars for August the 18th. We'll have our next AutoTalk, and again, that's the third Tuesday of every month. August the 18th is the next one, and that's going to be with Rich Sachs. He's going to present Understanding Your Manufacturer's Sales Performance Measurement. Being an old factory guy, one that dealt with the wholesale side of the business, and of course doing allocations and sales studies and looking at the Polk numbers. This one is really near and dear to my heart. It's something have had a lot of experience with, so I'll be really interested to hear what Rich has to present on this. One other quick item. We're going to draw 2 names here at the office of all those that registered for today's program, this afternoon's program specifically, and you will be contacted by us, the two names that we draw out. Land's End, another one of our affinity partners, has agreed to provide 2 new golf shirts with your company's logo on those shirts. So we'll be contacting the 2 winners of those shirts and getting the sizes and the logos and such regarding that. So again, thank you for joining us. Stay in touch. Watch for our next announcements. And as you know, AutoTalk is brought to you by AIADA, and AIADA is the only national trade association servicing America's international nameplate automobile dealers. We represent your interest here in Washington, D.C. If you want any additional information on AIADA, please visit our website at www.aiada.org. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, suggestions, please contact me personally. I'm at Barsond, B-A-R-S-O-N-D, at aiada.org. We'd love your feedback, and we would also like suggestions on future programming. So please feel free, drop a line. Thanks a lot for joining this afternoon. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.